right? Thanking God for, I don't want to say the freedom to make mistakes, but in times when we don't completely get it, the freedom to at least try. And that is what I'm going to do in this chapter that I want to call holler, understanding that we have a saying, maybe it's just a saying back down south, but a hit dog will holler. And as Jesus is simply talking to his disciples in this chapter, midway through the chapter, after the first, I guess, extended story or maybe even parable that he tells them, the Pharisees are going to begin to ridicule him, seeming to invoke that saying that a hit dog will holler, understanding that the story seems to implicate some things that they have been doing in this chapter. That seems to describe three ways in which we can become untrustworthy in God's sight. And it seems that Jesus has stumbled upon a way that he probably already knew, but he's stumbling on a way that is going to expose one of the ways that the Pharisees is in this chapter. Yeah, the Pharisees, verse 14, have likewise been unfaithful. Understanding that we have three sections, as I want to break it down, even though I think the ESV breaks it down into 4 sections. That middle section of the law and the kingdom of God and divorce and remarriage, I think I'd like to summarize as a single section, understanding that it may describe two ways in which the Pharisees, or we can all, if we're not careful, become unfaithful with regard to money. But that middle section talks about the way that those who had a responsibility to teach the law had become irresponsible in handling the law. And so they seem to be irresponsible in two ways discussed in 3 parables. Once again, irresponsible over money in the first and final story in the chapter, and in the middle, a story describing the way in which they were unfaithful over the law. Anyway, the first story, going from verses 1 through 13, giving us the famous parable of the dishonest manager, a manager who was caught, as I've probably described it before, cooking the books, as we might call it, caught up to a degree where he's basically going to get let go. But as we noticed on a Wednesday night, one of the reasons why sometimes folks will let someone go right away is that this manager takes his last few moments on the job to offer the chance to some of those who are indebted to his boss, a chance to write down or reduce the amount that they actually owe him. And the thing that the boss is going to do, as opposed to just being angry, is credit him for being shrewd, understanding that his time on the job is on the way out or is coming to a close. He is doing things that have the potential to open doors for him with those who will at least appreciate his kindness, even if they might think he's kind of shady, just as shady as the boss does. However, I'm going to skip the middle section about the Pharisees and their possible unfaithfulness over the law to compare it to the last story in the chapter, where we see the story of the rich man and Lazarus, going from verses 19 through the end of the chapter, appears to be verse 31 in the famous story where there was a rich man who feasted sumptuously every day, and outside his gates was a poor man by the name of Lazarus. The poor man, Lazarus, died and went to Abraham's bosom to be comforted, while the rich man perished and went to, I guess we would call the Hadean realm, where he was tormented. And from that place, he looked up to Father Abraham, as he calls him, and asks him to simply send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and simply relieve his suffering with just the amount of water, I guess the drop of water, that he could place on the tip of his tongue. And when Abraham says there is a great chasm or space between where Lazarus is being comforted and the rich man is being tormented, he says, no, that's not going to be possible. Lazarus can't come to comfort you. But in the alternative, the rich man asks at least for himself to be able to go back to his brother and fathers who have a chance to stay away from the place of torment. And likewise, Father Abraham, as cold as it may sound, says no. Because if they will not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not listen even if one returns from the dead, in an interesting parallel to what's about to happen in Israel, understanding the way that the Christ is going to die and be resurrected, and the story around his resurrection is actually going to be suppressed by many in the very same Pharisees we see in this chapter, because in that middle story, or that middle section that we skipped, going from verses, I'm turning 2 pages at a time, so it's hard for me to find where I'm exactly at. No, yeah, I am turning 2 pages at a time. No, I'm not. I'm just confused. Going from verses 14 as we're going to say it through 18, is going to show that after the first story, the story about the dishonest manager, when Christ sums it up by saying, we cannot serve two masters. You can't serve God and money. That's where the hit dog's going to holler, because they're going to begin to ridicule him, because it's literally going to say they were offended because they loved money, to which he is going to reply, you like to appear holy to others, but inwardly God understands your heart. And beyond the fact that you're insulting the Christ because you hate the fact that he is called into question your love of money, even beyond that, you're not really all that faithful over the law either. Understanding that it's going to go on to say in verse 16, the law and the prophets were until John. But since then, the good news of the kingdom is preached and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Introducing what seems to be a random verse, verse 18, which talks about the divorce law. And it's a very strict statement of the divorce law. But it may seem less random when we realize how Matthew has already gone into a longer description of the way that they were seemingly trying to water down the divorce law, which might be one of the low-key ways that Christ is doing something that you've probably had the chance to experience if you've had the chance to preach or try to teach from the word very often. It is the way in which there are times when you can tell a general story, not necessarily knowing what's going on in a crowd, but the response that you get, sometimes a very frustrated, angry, or retaliatory response, can indicate that you have stepped on toes you did not know were exposed. And so what we are seeing here is the way in which Christ is making some very general statements that go to the heart of some of the things that the Pharisees have become comfortable in doing wrong. As we mentioned before at the beginning of the chapter, talking about the way that they have grown a love for money that is watering down or preventing them from really serving God fully. And likewise, when they come into contact with parts of the law that conflict with the way that they would like to live their life, then it seems that they are likewise watering down the purity of their commitment to God's law by twisting it to fit the way they would like to live. And with that, it seems that Christ is providing hope in these two financial parables, understanding that the distinction that I saw between the story of the dishonest manager and the rich man and Lazarus may be this. Understanding that just to the degree that we have gone through the Gospels thus far, Jesus has told a number of stories that seem to describe the Pharisees and others as either unrighteous stewards, wicked tenants, either way, those who were not properly responsible over the things that they have been entrusted. But this chapter seems to give us two stories that describe two types of unrighteous stewards. One that is, in the first story, unrighteous but still wise, but in the last story, unrighteous remaining unwise, understanding that the dishonest manager at least had the wisdom to be kind enough to people to open doors once he was no longer welcomed managing his boss's affairs. However, the rich man might have lived so comfortably that he lost the wisdom to realize that, as we say from time to time, the way that he treated people still mattered to God, reminding me of one of the Proverbs, not necessarily attributed to Solomon. I think it's considered the words of Agur in verse 30, where he will say, in chapter 30 of Proverbs, round about verse 7, where he will say, two things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove from me falsehood and lying. Actually, remove far from me falsehood and lying, and give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. Seems to be words of wisdom from quite possibly a royal line of rich men, understanding that most of the Proverbs are written by Solomon. He is a rich man, however, who recalls the need in his wealth not to forget those who are lacking. And even if Agur is not from the royal line, David and Solomon set a precedent, understanding that once David was established on the throne of Israel, one of the things that distinguished him from Saul was Saul, as God had promised, was a man who was harsh on the very people who had asked for a king, even if they didn't know that Saul would be that king. And so David, in contrast, was beloved because he administered justice to all of the people, in contrast to the hard days that they had seen under Saul. And so moving forward, Christ, coming in the line of David, is likewise reminding those who have authority over the people in Israel at this time that they would be wise to understand that in their abundance, that they should not forget the needs of those around them, because wisdom helps us to understand ways in which our collective future might be more connected than we sometimes are able to see.